All right, we are back for the conclusion of chapter 2 of Brothers and Warriors, which is book number 1 in my Patriots of the American Revolution series. Give me a moment to don my new reading spectacles. But you recall, the boys had just loaded up their wagon. They were off for their volunteer mission in South Carolina. So we're going to pick right up where we left off. The 7-mile journey southwest to Charlotte passed relatively quickly. It was a trip that they had made together many times. The sun was well up and bright, and the main thoroughfare was bustling with life when the boys passed through town. The smell of fresh baked bread, smoky middling, and ham wafted from the windows of several taverns. John even caught a whiff of fresh coffee. He hated tea, but he loved his coffee. William begged James to stop so that they could get a little something hot to eat, but James denied his request. He wanted to push on and get close to as close to their destination as possible before dark. Once through Charlotte, they set off due south into the Waxhaws. A couple of hours later, they stopped along a small creek to eat and rest the horses. The boys shared a picnic of fried chicken that their mother had packed for the trip, cold fried potatoes and onions, biscuits with elderberry jelly, and fresh fried apple pies. They washed the hearty meal down with cool spring water from home, and then after their dinner, James smoked his clay pipe while the younger boys caught a quick nap in the shade. About a half hour later, James roused them from their slumber. "Get up, boys. We need to move on. We ain't going to get there tonight, but we need to move on as far as we can." "How far do you think we have to go, James?" questioned William. "I figure it's about another 15 or 16 miles, give or take. We've covered about 9 since we left home this morning. We've got good road and a pretty light load, all things considered. We're already into South Carolina. I reckon we're making pretty good time." "Do you think there'll be any redcoats close by?" queried John. "Nah, tain't no redcoats up here. There might be some egg-sucking Tory scum hereabouts and looking for trouble, though. We'd best be on our guard. Since there's still good road ahead, William can drive the rig whilst you and me keep watch, Johnny. Make sure your pan has a charge and keep your horn and measure close by." "It'll be slow going if we get into a shooting fight and have to measure powder straight out of the horn," John responded. "True. I reckon we should have rolled us a few cartridges before we left home. Don't know why I didn't think of that," mused James. John slapped his hands on his knees. "Well, why don't we go ahead and roll a few? We have some paper on a couple of these packages. You said we ain't going to get there tonight anyways. We could go ahead and prepare ourselves proper, even if it means a little longer trip in the morning." James rubbed his chin and pondered. "I reckon you're right. Johnny, fetch us some good paper and our shooting bags, and let's roll 10 or 12 loads apiece." John climbed up on the side of the wagon and found a parcel in the pile that was wrapped in brown paper. There weren't many such packages since paper was such a rarity and sold for a premium on the frontier. He unwrapped the contents of the parcel, 2 well-worn but cleaned and pressed boys' shirts, and returned them to the wagon. Grabbing the paper and their 3 leather bags, he returned to the shade beside the creek. Each of the boys reached into their leather bags and took out a small dowel stick that they used for rolling cartridges. They each rolled a tightly packed paper tube with a round ball at the tip of the dowel. John asked, "Buck too?" "Probably a pretty good idea," James responded. The boys then each added an additional 3 pellets of large buckshot to the end of their cartridges. They tied the bullet in and it closed with thread, removed the dowel, and then twisted and tied the tube just below the round ball. Each of them repeated the process 10 times, rolling 10 perfect cartridge tubes. Next, they took out their gunpowder measures and measured about 100 grains of powder, pouring it into each tube. The final step was crimping and folding the end with the powder. When they were done, each of the Hamilton boys had 10 fight-ready cartridges. They carefully placed the paper rolls into their bags. James and John had prepared loads for their 54 caliber smoothbore rifles. William had heftier 69 caliber loads for his stubby Brown Bess Sea Service musket that James had gotten for him in a trade the previous winter. The process took about an hour, so it was mid-afternoon when the Hamilton boys got back on the road. James rode with rifle at the ready and sat on the seat beside William. John made himself a small nest in the back of the wagon and kept watch to the rear. But much to his chagrin, the remainder of their travel that afternoon was uneventful. They encountered local farm inhabitants, mostly children on foot, and the occasional rider. No one gave them any trouble, although they did encounter one particularly nosy older gentleman on a mule, a fellow with an unintelligible Scottish brogue named Mr. MacLeod, who seemed a bit too interested in their wagon load of cargo. But he soon tired of James's vague answers and went about his own business. William kept the wagon going at a steady pace, stopping just once to water the horses in a shallow roadside pond. 4 hours after their extended lunch break, with about another 6 miles still to travel, sundown was imminent. They broke out of the thick Carolina forest into a wide area of grassland. Such meadows were not uncommon in the area. They were usually not very large, but these glades in the hills made beautiful homesteads and provided fertile land for farming. This particular oasis in the woods, for whatever reason, had not been settled as of yet. "It'll be dark in an hour," warned John. "Yep, this looks like as good a place as any to make camp for the night. Head yonder way, William," James urged, pointing to their left. James had spotted a secure place to camp about 100 yards to their east. It was a thick patch of pine trees on the edge of the glade, positioned along a small creek. There was a slight rise between the road and the trees, making only the top two-thirds of the trees visible from the road. William guided the team across the open grazing land toward the pines. As they neared the spot, James realized that it was indeed a perfect campsite. The pines backed up against a sharp outcropping of steep rock on the far side of the creek. Their camp would be protected from intruders from the rear, and with the hill blocking the view from the road, it would be safe enough for them to make a small fire. James jumped from the wagon as William halted the team at the edge of the glade. He stepped off a few yards into the woods and scouted the site, returning quickly. "Right here, William. Point the horses yonder way and line up the wagon across here, right at the edge of the trees," James instructed. "We'll drop a canvas on the far side to help block the light from our fire, and then we can just sleep right under the wagon." William clicked at the horses and pulled the reins to the right, turning the wagon out into the glade into a big circle, then bringing it back around and parallel with the trees. He parked the rig at the edge of the pines, placing its frame between the campsite and the road. James watered the team in the creek and tethered them to the edge of the tall grass to graze. He then struck out walking into the woods, saying that he was going to scout the place out and make sure there weren't any surprises. He was also looking for a little fresh game for supper. John and William started to prepare the camp. The first order of business was to clear out the pine needles to make a clear spot and dig a hole for a cooking fire. Placing the fire a foot deep in the ground would help conceal the light of the flames. John dug the fire hole, whilst William kicked and pushed mounds of soft, dry pine needles underneath the wagon for bedding under their sleeping blankets. Afterward, they teamed up to loosen the canvas from the wagon and then drape it on the far side of the rig toward the road. Both boys jumped when a single shot rang out somewhere to their south. "That was pretty close," whispered William. "Yeah, just a couple 100 yards. Don't worry, little brother. It sounded like James's Fowler rifle to me. I bet he just got us some meat." 10 minutes later, they heard James whistle. John responded with a shrill whistle of his own. Then James's smiling face came bobbing over a slight rise in the woods. He carried a rather large, plump turkey over his right shoulder and a huge grin on his face. "Roast turkey!" William exclaimed. "You two haven't started the fire yet?" James asked incredulously as he walked into the camp. "'Twas just about to, right before you whistled. It won't take me long," retorted John. John took his fire-starting tin out of his leather bag and went to work. He grabbed a handful of pine needles and placed them beside his fire hole. Next, he unrolled his supply of charcloth, took out a small square of the blackened cotton fabric, and placed a healthy wad of tow beside the cloth. It took only 2 strikes of his flint on a piece of steel to capture a spark on the charcloth. He picked it up in his hands and placed the tow on top, forming a perfect bird's nest. Then he began to blow. The spark grew into a larger ember, and rapidly heated the tow. It only took a few minutes for the tow to burst into flame in his hands. He carefully placed the flaming wad into the hole, added a few pine needles and twigs, and soon he had a roaring little fire. The entire process took less than 5 minutes. He looked at his older brother with a prideful look of self-satisfaction. James just smiled and nodded. It took a half hour for James and William to pluck and clean the birds sufficiently for cooking, which gave John plenty of time to add some larger pieces of wood and build a substantial bed of piping hot coals down in the fire hole. Once the bird was cleaned and washed in the creek, James rigged the meat on a makeshift spit. He cut the beautiful pink breast meat off the bone and removed the thigh and leg quarters from the carcass, mounting each separately along the spit for quicker cooking. He kept some of the fattier parts with the skin attached and wrapped them around the breast meat to provide some extra grease. Them beasties will get all dried out if we don't grease them up a bit, he explained to his brothers. For the next hour, they took turns roasting the meat so that it would cook uniformly through. They snacked on some dried apples and pecans as they waited. When the meat was almost ready, John fetched their water jugs and the basket that their mother had prepared for them. Though they had eaten most of her goodies at lunchtime, there was still a sack full of fried cornbread cakes and about a half a jar of their mama's elderberry jam. James slid the succulent meat off of the spit onto a pewter plate that came out of their mama's basket. John said grace, and then the Hamilton boys indulged in a delicious feast. They talked, and they laughed, and they ate. And it didn't take long until every morsel of the turkey was gone, and every corn cake was consumed. William lapped the final drops of jam out of the jar before returning it to the basket. After dinner, a raucous belching contest ensued, but James put a stop to it when it appeared that William might actually throw up his supper if he didn't quit. James took out his clay pipe and to send the signal that it was time for everyone to calm down and relax. John retrieved his own pipe from the loop on the front of his tobacco sack that hung loosely from his neck. They each packed their pipes with aromatic tobacco and lit them with a coal from one of the campfires. "Can I have a puff, Jamie?" begged William. "Heck no. You're near about lost your supper from laughing already. If you get any of this tobacco smoke in you, I'm afraid you might turn green and die." John laughed. William pouted. James pondered. "This sure is an adventure, ain't it, James?" mused John. "I reckon," he replied. "But remember, we ain't even going 30 miles from home. It ain't like we're going down to Charlestown to spy on the redcoats or nothing. Just going down to help out a poor widder lady for a spell." "I know, but it's still exciting. I mean, as long as I can remember, I've never been out of Mecklenburg County before this very day." "Just don't go dreaming up a bunch of nonsense," James cautioned. "There ain't no shooting war down in the Waxhaws, just a few thieving Tories that killed a good man. We're going down here to be good Christian neighbors and to do us a good deed." "I'm trying," John yawned, "but sometimes I can't help it. You boys better go and get under the wagon and get some sleep. I thought maybe we'd better keep a lookout during the night, but I don't reckon we really need to. After you boys lay down a spell, and I'll cover the fire for the night, we should be just fine in the dark. I'll stay awake just a bit longer, and I'll put the fire out just to make sure, but leave me some room. I'm planning to crawl under there with you pretty soon." John got up and headed to the wagon with William. They got all three of their blankets out, leaving James's folded neatly in the center space under the wagon so that he could easily crawl out of his makeshift bed in the dark. The two younger boys made their places on either side of James under the wheel axles and settled down into deep burrows of soft pine needles. They quickly drifted off into a deep and dreamless sleep. So that's the end of chapter 2 of Brothers and Warriors. Come back next time and we'll pick right up where we left off. We'll continue the story with chapter 3. I thank you for listening.